it's impossible to dream something that you can't see. And so there were so many women who wanted to be more active in politics, who just never really thought that if you can't get all the way to the top, I guess you're just like going to do it so you can get as far as you can go. But the idea that you could potentially, that the world was open, that the country was open to the idea of having a woman in the executive office, I think was really powerful.
Welcome back to That's the Ticket, a Pod Save America miniseries where we explore what goes into the vice presidential selection process. I'm Dan Pfeiffer.
And I'm Alyssa Mastromonaco.
On last week's episode, we dug into the vetting and announcement process and why everything is kept so secret. Today, we're going to focus on Joe Biden's announcement that he will pick a woman, how it has changed the selection process, and how the candidacies of Geraldine Ferraro and Sarah Palin got us to where we are today. Alyssa, before we get into it, how you doing?
Buddy, I'm great. How are you?
Yeah, I mean, all things considered, I'm pretty good. How do you feel now that we have one of these under our belt?
I'm going to be very vulnerable right now and say that we got such extraordinarily great feedback that people said they didn't know how we could top the first episode. And so I've been thinking about it a lot. So I'm bringing my A game today.
Do you feel a lot of pressure?
I do feel pressure. I don't want to let our fans who care about the vice presidential selection process down.
You know, sequels are hard, is what I would say. So everyone keep that in mind. Could be Godfather 2. Could be Beverly Hills Cop 2. We don't know.
Or it could be Godfather 3.
That was my joke for the next episode of our, because this is really a trilogy, but
I bet you didn't think I knew, though, that Godfather 3 won Oscars.
You know what? I did think you knew that. Back in March, right before the entire country went into coronavirus lockdown, the DNC held its final presidential primary debate between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. On stage, Joe Biden made a historic commitment and provided the most memorable moment of the night.
If I'm elected president, my cabinet, my administration will look like the country. And I commit that I will, in fact, I'll pick a woman to be vice president. There are a number of women who are qualified to be president tomorrow. I would pick a woman to be my vice president.
Just to be clear, you just committed here tonight that your running mate, if you get the nomination, will be a woman?
Yes.
Alyssa, I want to separate two things. The decision to put a woman on the ticket and the decision to announce you're going to put a woman on the ticket in advance. What was your reaction when you heard Biden say that? And why do you think he made that announcement when he did?
Let me stipulate up front that I tend to find Joe Biden to be a very sincere person, right? So I appreciate that he understands that it's important for women to see themselves in executive office, to feel invested in the process, and that it's time. However, doing it at a debate felt like such a stunt that it cheapened it, I think. You know, it made it feel like a stunt. And women are 50% of the population. I think it's more than reasonable that a woman would be picked to be a running mate. But yeah, I thought that it's obviously good that a woman will be, vice president for the first time ever. But I thought that doing it in the debate felt stuntish.
It's interesting. There were a lot of people who shared your view who expressed that afterwards. And the announcement itself can't be separated from the context in which it's happening, which is, as I mentioned, it's the final debate. On stage that night were Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and only Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. And at the time, they were competing for the votes of a number of talented women who had not made it as far in the process, most notably Elizabeth Warren, who had dropped out, I believe, the week prior. And they were both courting her endorsement and her supporters. And so there was that political overhang on it. So I think if you were to ask the Biden campaign, beyond just the debate strategy of wanting to have the moment of debate and driving the conversation, which they certainly did here, because all the news was about, this a truly historic announcement, not the disagreements between Biden and Bernie on Medicare for all or the Iraq War or the other issues of the campaign. But I think other than that, the other argument I think folks on the Biden side would make is that question was going to hang over the entire process no matter what. And Biden had already come to the conclusion that that's what he was going to do. So why be coy about it? I think I think that would be their case. But you can see the argument where doing it that way potentially lifts up the idea of women in politics broadly, but has the potential to be diminishing to the to the individual woman who was selected, right?
Right. And the other thing I'd say, though, too, is that because there would have been pressure, I completely understand why he did it, because better to do it than to look in like 4 or 5 weeks like you got gangstered into it. You know, like you didn't really want to do it and you got forced into doing it. So that's why I say, like, I find him to be an incredibly sincere person. So I don't think, it feels stuntish, but I know that, either way it would have, there would have been criticism.
How do you think that pronouncement has affected the process thus far?
Well, the thing that we always talk about, if you go back to the beginning of time, well, for people like you and I who have watched this very, closely for years and years, that going back to the beginning of our memory, these things can be called a beauty contest. There's like a very different weird feeling, though, when it's just all women being compared to each other, that the beauty contest analogy takes on like an even more uncomfortable, sort of feeling. But no, I mean, look, I think that, my perspective is that it's been largely the same as all the other sort of machinations and reporting around other VP selections, except this is just all women.
Joe Biden's decision to put a woman on the ticket will be only the third time in American history that a woman has been the vice presidential nominee for a major party. I want to talk about Geraldine Ferraro first. For those who do not know or may not remember, Geraldine Ferraro was a 3-term New York Congresswoman and former prosecutor who was chosen by Walter Mondale as his running mate in the 1984 presidential election. It was a historic choice at the time. Mondale had signaled he was considering multiple women, which was notable certainly at the time, but he had not committed to choosing a woman before Ferraro was announced as his running mate. Now, when you and I had our first conversation a few months ago about potentially doing a project around the vice presidential selection process, the first thing you said to me was that you wanted to talk about Geraldine Ferraro. What is it that has made you so fascinated by that part of American history?
So I think, you and I are the exact same age, which means we were like 7 or 8 when this was all happening. So I remember this was happening, but I never remembered all of the stories and the real history around it. And so a couple years ago, I just started doing a lot of research. Let's go back to the beginning of time, 1983. The ERA had just failed, and the National Organization of Women now, which younger people may not remember now, but it was probably one of the most important feminist organizations back ever. They held their national convention, and at their convention, they passed a resolution. The resolution said the vice president must be a woman. The Democrats must put a woman on the ticket, or they will urge, the National Organization of Women will urge a floor fight at the convention in 1984. And so it was taken pretty seriously, because this was sort of the beginning of the point where women weren't seen as a special interest group, but as like 50% of the country that they were. And so it was taken seriously, and the National Organization of Women had endorsed Mondale before any of this was happening. But then when he became the nominee, he understood that this could really be a historic moment. And so he considered women, and, women like Dianne Feinstein was on the short list. Barbara Mikulski, one of my Senate icons, was on the list. And Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House at the time, urged Mondale to consider Geraldine Ferraro, because she was, for lack of a better description, she was her history. She was the daughter of illiterate Italian immigrants. She was working class. She had put herself through law school. She graduated in the top 10%. She went on to be ADA, assistant district attorney in Queens County. And my favorite fun fact about her, actually established what was then called the Special Victims Bureau, SVU, Law and Order, for those of you who watch. Tip O'Neill thought that she had incredible political chops. She knew how to get things done. She could represent the women, but she also really got along with the men, and the men appreciated her, because when she talked about feminism, she didn't say it was anything. She didn't make it about men. She just made it about all of them working together and being equal. So Tip O'Neill was really sort of instrumental in getting her the consideration that she was due.
I'm really glad that you pushed us to talk about this because, you know, like you, I was quite young for this election. And the 1984 election is sort of an election for a lot of political junkies that's lost to history. Mm-hmm. You know, Democrats don't like discussing an election where we lost the Electoral College 525 to 13, where the Mondale ticket only won Minnesota and the District of Columbia. But it also sort of was the last election before it became sort of part of the process where every election would be filled with a bunch of tell-all books. It was in the 1988 election where Richard Ben Cramer wrote What It Takes, the all-time greatest political campaign book. And every election since then has been filled with these insider accounts. That's sort of missing in 1984. And so, but when you go back and you read the history about it and you look what happened, it really was, and particularly around the selection of Geraldine Ferraro, it both helps explain the situation, how we get to the situation we're in. It was the beginning of a lot of really important movement in the American politics writ large, in the Democratic Party specifically. And there are a couple of political factors here that I think are really interesting about how Geraldine Ferraro ended up on the ticket. One, in 1980, even though Reagan beat Carter, Carter did better with women than men. And so this was the beginning of what is known as the gender gap, which has been a factor in American politics ever since, where Democrats do better with women. And, groups like Now, like you mentioned, emphasize that and use that as a pressure point on Democratic politicians to do the right thing and take women seriously. But also, someone who played an important role in this that isn't talked about a lot is Jesse Jackson. Because Jesse Jackson got in the race and he pledged to pick a woman if he was the nominee, which changed the conversation around Mondale, who, was a former vice president, was the front runner, and put pressure on. And, you can see, what happened with Mondale. We'll talk about this with Palin and how it applies to Joe Biden's decision as we go through this podcast. But it shows that a lot has changed over time, but not enough when you look at the treatment of it. A lot of women, like Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi, and women who ran up and down the ballot and just followed politics, were inspired by Mondale's selection of Ferraro. The 1984 convention and Ferraro's speech is incredibly moving. I'd recommend checking out the documentary Geraldine Ferraro, Paving the Way, if you want to learn more about this. In that documentary, one of my favorite moments is the response to the pick from Congresswoman and future Senator Barbara Mikulski. This is how she responded to the news.
It was Congresswoman Barbara Kennelly saying to me, "She got the call. She got the call." And there's the press, and they wanted to interview me. And there I am, in my sleeping togs, picking up the window, yelling down at the media saying, "Mazel tov, it's a girl! Mazel tov, it's a girl!"
In St. Paul, Minnesota now, Geraldine Ferraro and Walter Mondale at the Minnesota State Capitol.
How do you think Geraldine Ferraro's candidacy served as inspiration for a lot of women in politics?
Well, I think, it was sort of true when we worked for the Obama campaign in 2007 and 2008. It's impossible to dream something that you can't see. And so there were so many women who wanted to be more active in politics, who just never really thought that if you can't get all the way to the top, I guess you're just going to do it so you can get as far as you can go. But the idea that you could potentially, that the world was open, that the country was open to the idea of having a woman in the executive office, I think was really powerful. And we've seen a lot in our time. And even when I watch her give her speech accepting the nomination at the convention in San Francisco in 1984, it's very emotional because it still hasn't happened, right? Hillary, of course, ran for president, but she hasn't won. And so I think that back then, the idea that it was possible, it inspired more women to run and to participate in the process, and just also be really hopeful that they actually were being looked at as 50% of the actual population and not just, women.
It is when you read about and you watch the response, not just among women politicians like Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi and others, but you see the response among women around the country in that moment. I mean, Geraldine Ferraro became an instant national celebrity. She was sort of a much bigger draw on the campaign trail at times than Mondale himself. It does show that representation matters, right? That having a woman on the ticket said something about, to a lot of women, men and women, frankly, about what women could do. And, you know, I think that should never be, it's discounted, the importance of it. Even, you know, and it had, you know, to be very clear, Mondale was a massive underdog the entire campaign. Reagan was quite popular.
Right.
He seemed cruising to re-election. The Mondale campaign was down 15 points prior to the Ferraro selection. And after picking Geraldine Ferraro, they roared into essentially a tie. I think the response to Ferraro speaks to both the potential and the peril of picking a woman as your vice president. You are picking a woman in an environment that even all these years later is still filled with misogyny, right? In media, in politics, in the populace. And you can see in the response, you know, like some of the responses to Ferraro, you know, seem, you know, maybe they seem incredibly out of date now, but they're actually not that unfamiliar to what Hillary Clinton faced in 2008, 2016, that all of the women who ran for president in 2020 faced. And so, but I want to talk about that. You know, it's pretty clear in 1984 that the treatment Ferraro received on the campaign trail was pretty sexist. She got asked on Meet the Press if she was, quote, strong enough to push the button, referring to her willingness to deploy nuclear weapons during the Cold War. Ferraro later talked about the press coverage itself, telling a documentarian this.
Press was very hard on me, very hard. Especially the white men, you know, it's always like taking an exam. Do you have an exam on foreign policy? Because, Jerry, you're now going to take it. And the stuff about, are you tough enough to push the button? My response was also been, I'm tough enough to make sure that I have policies in place where you don't have to push the button.
Alyssa, and it wasn't just the press or even white men that, you know, had a very sexist response to Geraldine Ferraro. You know, there was in the documentary, you know, there's this amazing clip of Ferraro campaigning in Mississippi, where she's sitting next to a much older white politician who is not named, who turns and asks her, can you make blueberry muffins? To which she, little lady. Yes, little lady, can you make blueberry muffins? And she, you know, at first is obviously taken back a little bit, but without sort of missing a beat, turns to him and says, yes, I can. Can you? Which I thought was an absolutely great response. But there's also, you know, a pretty famous story about Barbara Bush. Do you want to tell that story?
Sure. Well, and Barbara Bush. So the interesting thing, though, too, I think, just to go back one beat that I don't want to miss the point on, is that in 1984, women thought, the women of the Mondale campaign and like feminist leaders did take the choice so deadly serious because they didn't want it to be seen as symbolic, right? They wanted whoever ran to really be able to sort of take the punches and be a real contender. And so Geraldine Ferraro, I think, did match the moment in that regard. And, you know, like you said, down in Mississippi, they asked her, you know, can she make muffins? And then you have the media just really sort of loved this, like the fact that she was a woman. And in some instances, they really wanted to be able to write the story that Mondale had picked a woman and she didn't get across the fucking finish line. And so they blew up this interaction into just something seismic when Barbara Bush, who was campaigning for her husband, was out, and someone asked her a question off the record about Geraldine Ferraro, and she said that she rhymes with rich. And so everyone extrapolates that means bitch. Barbara later says that it meant witch because it was right before Halloween. Either way, the media blows this up. Barbara Bush says to her husband that she thinks she sunk the campaign. She can't believe she did this. She's so sorry. So the first thing she does, also without missing a beat, is call Ferraro to apologize. And Ferraro, kind of as a testament to her political grit, was like, girl, we're good. You know, she's like, Barbara, don't even worry about it. It wasn't even that bad. Like, we're good. And Barbara Bush, in retelling the story, just says, like, she was so gracious. Like, I couldn't believe it. I was so upset. And this was her response to me. And then, of course, the media, frothing at the mouth, stalks Jerry Ferraro down like prey. And it's like, is it true? Is it true? She apologized to you. She's like, yeah, Barbara Bush is a great lady. And so in so many ways, like the sort of narrative that this cat fight that the media was dying for, she just wouldn't give it to them. And she was like, no, Barbara Bush is a great lady. So moving on. And you can even see when you watch the coverage that reporters were like disappointed. They were like, no, tell us she's a bitch too. But she would do no such thing because she truly just understood it was, par for the course.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many dynamics that we've seen play themselves out in politics in the years since in the press coverage, right? One is trying to pit two women against each other, right? Whether that is Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama, whether it is Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, or whatever it is, like that is always a frequent dynamic. Another part of the campaign there was this intense press coverage on the finances of Geraldine Ferraro's husband, John Zaccaro, that dominated the coverage for a month. And, and the thing that people can understand was they filed their taxes separately because she had a separate career from his business. And that was treated as essentially a crime that she was trying to hide things, so like you really got to see for the first time how things would play themselves out for a year. And, the dynamic also played itself out in the debate between Ferraro and Vice President George H.W. Bush, which was much more historic than I think one would think, because, now it is tradition for the vice presidential candidates to debate each other. But this was actually, the Ferraro-Bush debate was actually only the second vice presidential nominee debate in history. Bush had not debated Mondale when Mondale was Carter's vice president in the 80 election. And it was a very historic moment. And it was, a lot of people had questioned Ferraro's foreign policy and national security experience. And during that debate, Bush took the opportunity to try to call her knowledge into question. Here's one of the most memorable exchanges.
Let me help you with the difference, Ms. Ferraro, between Iran and the embassy in Lebanon. Iran, we were held by a foreign government. In Lebanon, you had a wanton terrorist action where the government opposed it.
Congresswoman Ferraro.
Let me just say, first of all, that I almost resent, Vice President Bush, your patronizing attitude that you have to teach me about foreign policy.
What was your reaction to that, Alyssa?
I think it could be summed up by the quote of the editor of Ms. Magazine back after the debate, which was, "You can't make a man look that bad and live." I loved it. I thought it was so good. I can't even take credit for it. She was so funny. But no, I mean, look, she had both of them went into that debate with sort of impossible expectations, right? Like, George Bush couldn't be patronizing, which, I'm sure was hard, turned out to be a little hard. She had to, Ferraro talks about how going into the debate, she both had to think about toning herself down with her, she talked about how she communicated through her sense of humor, her queen's sense of humor. And she knew that she couldn't do that on stage because she didn't want to be seen as aggressive. At the same time, she was worried about how short she was compared to him. She was only 5'4". And so, I mean, it's just an incredible thing to think about all the things going on inside your head that aren't directly related to substance of what you're going to have to say. But an interesting thing for people who watch debates like we do is that it was the first time in the 1984 vice presidential debate they built a very invisible ramp for her so that people wouldn't actually see how short she was. And then they built a platform within the podium so that they would look closer in height, which is something that is still done to this day.
For shorter presidential candidates. Now, Trump, I think, potentially just puts lifts in issues, which is why he always that's why he always stands like he's being pulled forward by some sort of invisible centrifugal force. Obviously, the choice was historic, right? The election result was not good by any stretch of imagination, but I don't think anyone blames Ferraro for that loss. I mean, it did, Mondale was going to lose that election, whether he picked Geraldine Ferraro, Ted Kennedy, the, high school age Barack Obama, whatever, he was going to, that was just the fact of the matter. But, one thing that I think is notable is that it appeared to leave an impression, at least on, while inspired women all across the country, and I think of both parties, frankly, about what was possible. It appears to have left a bad taste in the mouth of the overwhelmingly male decision makers in American politics, because it was 24 years later before a woman was on the ticket again. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that when we look back in time, what so many people just remember is that they lost, right? They lost. You picked a woman and they lost. Even though he was probably always going to lose. And I actually give her mad credit for even taking the job and giving up her congressional seat, because it was such a stretch, that they would win. I think that if you are a man who's running for president, you see sort of the challenges that a woman faced that others, it was Geraldine Ferraro, by, being a woman and a Roman Catholic, was her feet were held to the fire time after time over her stance on abortion. It was the first time in picking a woman that a spouse's, finances and a spouse's profile were brought into question and vetted at the level that they were. And so I think that, you take a big risk. It's big risk, big reward, right? And I think a lot of people who ran for president after that didn't see the upside.